Welcome to level 16 out of the 31 levels of the 613 degrees or rungs on Jacob's ladder. It is good practice to not be a charmer. In terms of negativity, when one charms themselves, they fascinate and convince themselves that negativity is attractive and should be performed or drawn to. For instance, one can fascinate oneself that bragging is attractive because it possibly could make a person look good to others, but in actuality, bragging is frowned upon, and others usually perceive the bragger as arrogant and narcissistic. It is also good not to be a necromancer. A necromancer is a conjurer of spiritual death. Spiritual death is metaphorical for a death or great loss in one's life, so it is good practice to not be a necromancer towards others and self, to avoid creating great losses for others and self. Risk is associated with necromancing. When someone takes a great risk, they can possibly endanger the life or happiness in oneself and others as well. For instance, gambling could be a cause of becoming a necromancer, which could lead to a great monetary loss. When someone loses a lot of something in any area in their life, this is considered spiritual death. When it is money, a home, a relationship, a job, or a family member, one should try their best to avoid taking a great loss or spiritual death. It is also good practice to not consult or take advice from egoistic desires, thoughts, emotions, actions, and restraints. First, a person can turn to egoistic desires, thoughts, emotions, actions, and restraints, and then the next step is to move towards and accept the advice from these things. A person should not want to relive an egoistic desire, thought, emotion, action, or restraint of the past that caused them harm. In desperation, such an action can occur where one wants to revert to these egoistic memories and consults and takes advice from them, thinking it is good to revert to them and receive transitory, transient, fleeting pleasures, but in reality they are only hurting themselves. An example of turning to and consulting egoism would be to get high off of drugs instead of life. This is an egoistic choice and would lead to a fleeting pleasure as opposed to someone trying to get high off of life by spending time with loved ones, family members, and friends. Spending high quality time with people is the result of turning to and consulting altruistic desires, thoughts, emotions, actions, and restraints, which results in a longer lasting enjoyment called joy as opposed to the fleeting one that drugs provide. It is good practice for men not to wear women's garments or clothes and for women not to wear men's clothes. We're not talking about physical clothes and gender, but the metaphor of male and female and spiritual clothes. Men is a metaphor for an action, and a woman is a metaphor for a restraint. Men are more active and women are more passive in life. That is why there is a metaphorical association with gender. So what this means is that it is a good practice for a person to avoid refraining themselves or restraining themselves when it is necessary to act, and to avoid acting when it is necessary to refrain or restrain themselves. It is also good practice to not make permanent negative actions and permanent negative restraints. An example of a permanent action is to forever insult and act judgmental towards people. One should gradually throughout their life learn to refrain from insulting and practice mercy and forgiveness. An example of a permanent restraint is to avoid giving money to the poor. If one eventually earns a good amount of money, they should share some of that money, as long as they don't need it, to the poor, needy, and unfortunate. It is important not to remove virtue. Once a good quality is attained and performed, one should honor and hallow that good positive virtue. Virtues should be hallowed and valued very highly because they are very honorable and make self and others happy. Once a person becomes virtuous, they should not return to a sinful life, which is called returning to Egypt. Egypt is a code word for egoism and selfishness, and Israel is a code word for altruism and selflessness. So once a person becomes virtuous, they should avoid at all costs returning back to a sinful lifestyle and preserve their virtue. They should avoid seeking or searching for other gods or idols, choosing or selecting after consideration other gods or idols, going towards other gods or idols, and to not allow these idols to work on them. So avoiding, seeking, choosing, going, and allowing idolatry are ways to avoid returning back to Egypt, or a state of slavery towards the ego. An example would be to seek money greedily. Then once find a way to make a great amount of money, choose or decide to pursue getting that money greedily. Then go after it and pursue it further, making more and more money. Finally, allowing greed to work on a person, corrupting them, putting money above all else, worshiping money over God. These micro rungs should not be overanalyzed, but just viewed as one macro rung generally, with the intention of avoiding returning to idolatry and a state of worshiping other gods. It is also important to not make a covenant or agreement with the 7 deadly sins. It is also important not to save the 7 deadly sins and preserve them. Mercy should also not be shown towards the 7 deadly sins. Sometimes we get caught up in greed and make a deal with the ego or Satan or Satan, which is the opponent, and we enslave ourselves to greed and the other deadly sins. This is called making a covenant with the 7 deadly sins. Sometimes we break the habit of greed with moderation and recall potent, fleeting pleasures that are missed and save and show mercy to greed or any of the other deadly sins, regressing back to egoism. So it is also important to not save the 7 deadly sins in the back of our minds and show mercy to them.